My name is Anthony Grimes, and currently I serve as the Director of Campaigns and Strategy for the world's oldest and largest interfaith peace and justice organization, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. We were founded on the eve of World War I. Several of our members came together in Cologne, Germany, and said after the war started that though our countries may be at war, may we never be at war. And that's how the fellowship began. I currently live and reside in Denver, Colorado. I have 2 kids, Micah and Anaya, and they're a big part of how I view nonviolent resistance and nonviolence as a way of life. I was also a student of the great Vincent Harding, who is a veteran of the freedom movement of the 60s, worked side by side with King, and is perhaps most known for writing the speech Beyond Vietnam, which is perhaps King's fullest expression of his opposition to U.S. imperialism in the form of militarism, racism, and materialism, the triple evils. I currently help design our campaigns in various cities and help to coordinate with our partner groups and affiliates and members all across the U.S. And our goal as a U.S.-based branch of the fellowship is to look at how the U.S. is complicit right here on these grounds and on this shore in various crimes and tendencies and illnesses that spread globally if we don't stop them here. And so the majority of my work is focused in the U.S., although I also travel internationally and do human rights organizing all over the world. Nonviolent resistance is essential to moving to a world beyond war. It's the most creative and powerful mechanism for social change that we've ever seen. What's the importance of nonviolence in theory and in practice? Well, first of all, there was a lot of, in the beginning of thinking about nonviolence as it applied to social movements, much of it centered around this moral conversation with how nonviolence is morally superior to violence when it came to revolution. And as someone who centers on a Christian perspective, and by that I fundamentally mean the importance of love and the importance of forgiveness, love, mercy, redemption in our walk towards the world, I definitely resonate with the moral quality of a nonviolent life and the ways in which it opens possibilities for people to change. It opens up possibilities for a narrative, because that's what, in my opinion, Jesus introduced to the world more than anything else, is this narrative that there was a possibility to love even those who hated you. And that's more than anything what I see as being brand new in the Christian tradition, and its best offering is that we have inserted a new possibility in the narrative of how you deal with one's enemies, how you deal with your opposition. And it's beyond that of revenge and kill and to take an eye for an eye. But beyond that, nonviolence has since developed from a social perspective because of how effective it is. And so when I talk about nonviolence and the reason why I follow it, it's not just from this moralistic perspective and this dogmatic perspective that those who do violence are wrong, because often, though that's not my practice, I understand definitely with compassion why somebody would want to take up arms in certain struggles. But I tend towards nonviolent resistance because it's been proven to be effective. In the last 100 years, there have been various scholars, especially maybe most noteworthy is Maria Stephan, Erica Chenoweth, who have studied the last 100 years of nonviolent revolution and conflict. And in that, they've seen a trend towards nonviolent revolutions being more successful than violent revolutions. 1 in 4 nonviolent revolutions fail. That means 3 in 4 succeed, whereas 3/4 of violent revolutions do in fact fail. And I think a large part of this is simply from the practical perspective that it takes a lot for someone to get involved with a violent revolution. You have to be willing to kill and to die and to use arms and to be an outright criminal of the state. There's a high threshold for someone who's willing to join your movement and commit to violence. And then you eliminate a large portion of the population. You don't have grandmothers who can contribute more often than not. You don't have kids, sometimes women. And so you're focusing on a very select few people who are mostly men, mostly younger, and the ways in which they can help with the revolution. And you're neglecting the elders and everyone outside of that pocket of people. So just from a pure practical standpoint, if to the extent that numbers are important for winning any kind of campaign, we open ourselves up more to those numbers when we take a nonviolent approach. But in addition to that, we also open ourselves up to the creativity that comes with those numbers. And so now, instead of, and that's the number one thing for me, when violence is introduced to the equation, when people lean on guns to solve problems, it reduces the level of creativity that we can bring to a conflict, as opposed to the thinking that comes about when we have to think beyond violence, when it's not an option to yell and to go off and to shoot and to hurt. Well, you have to think strategically, well, what is an option? What can we do? And often what happens in lieu of violence and violent thinking is more powerful, more creative, and more effective. And that's a big part of why I believe in the way of nonviolence, not just from a moral perspective, but also from a pragmatic perspective as well. FOR has contributed much to pretty much every, if not every, then most nonviolent social movement of the last 100 years. And most recently, it's been with the movement for Black Lives. And there have been people among us, most notably Reverend Sekou, Gretchen Honold, others who have done powerful organizing work within hotspot cities that were definitely in need of building capacity for the movement. And that often looked like leading workshops and classes on nonviolent resistance from a personal and communal level, and training people to on how to be organizers and frontline militant nonviolent direct action resistors in Standing Rock, Baltimore, Ferguson, Oakland, all across the nation, Minnesota. So our presence was felt in the movement for Black Lives Matter. Currently, we are working on a campaign around the issue and topic of reparations. And so some of that work will continue, much of that work will continue, in addition to also, I think one of the things we do when we're at our best is to serve as a call to conscience. And so on the spectrum of nonviolence, if you look at someone like Gene Sharp, the protest, the demonstration is just one form of nonviolent resistance. But when you look at the many ways that you can resist nonviolently, there's also a mental engagement and designing of campaigns and literature and words and symbols. And so we try to engage at that level as well with how we educate about certain issues and our direct correlation to those issues, as well as how we call people to a deeper understanding of morality and a sense of what it means to be human in our country. There's somewhat of a false divide between the practical side of nonviolence and the moral side of nonviolence. And I would say that at its best, these things are working hand in hand. I think some of how I deal with this apparent divide is to think through, after the systems are changed, after revolution is won, we still must deal with what kind of people are we going to be. And the people inhabit systems, and therefore to not give serious attention to the kind of people and human beings that we're somehow being shaped into by our practices is a mistake. But I definitely resonate with those who would like to move the discussion away from this dogmatic framework of nonviolence being morally superior than violence. I hold the position that I, when available, when possible, a love, not a sentimental love, but the kind of revolutionary love that Dr. King talked about, is an orientation of life that should be considered by all. That being said, I view compassionately struggles that, for whatever reason, come to the conclusion that picking up arms in this situation is the way to go. And I know that can't be decided upon lightly, but though I don't take that approach, I think it's important for both sides to have compassionate understandings of the other and to recognize that in reality, the community doesn't see it as two different sides. When we are in Baltimore or whatever communities, whatever city, the number one discussion that I think should be centered is not, are we going to use violent or nonviolent strategy? That's a strategic discussion. But what I try to center and encourage people to center is, who's hurting here? What help do they need? What are their stories? What are their assets? What is uniquely beautiful about this group of people? And how do we come alongside them and build on those assets and build towards something beautiful, what Dr. King and others would call the beloved community? But to come in with this idea that we have a certain framework and to put it on every community as if it's the way to go, I'm with you in the sense that strikes me as not only dogmatic but counterproductive. And it does turn people off who would otherwise say, if we're talking about doing something that works in the community to get results, then I'm in. But if we're talking about a gospel of nonviolence, then I'm out. And I say, go ahead and have the pragmatic lens. So ideally, you'd be able to have a lens for nonviolent revolution that was strictly pragmatic, and then one in which it was pragmatic but also discussed the spiritual side and nonviolence as a way of life beyond just its effect. When I think about the ordinary person and what people on an everyday level could do to incorporate nonviolence as a way of life, I can't even engage the discussion without thinking about the importance of a Buddhist perspective as it relates to recognizing the basic goodness of life and of everybody. And that perspective, even as someone who practices within Christianity, has shaped me tremendously when you think about the fact, first and foremost, that there's basic goodness within myself and within other people and within the universe. There's this idea that I draw heavily upon, and it discusses the difference between pronia and paranoia. Paranoia is this idea that the universe is conspiring against us, and therefore life is a zero-sum mentality. I got to get mine or else someone's going to take it from me, versus pronia, which is the idea that the universe is conspiring with us and for us on our behalf. And it's this idea that there isn't a lack of resources or goodness to go around. And so I think it's engaging this fundamental mindset that I am basically good. The human beings and the universe, the creation around me is basically good, even when everything speaks against that. And therefore, how do I move and relate to the world in a way that acknowledges the basic goodness of everyone? My son, my daughter, my spouse, my friends, those who might appear to be my quote-unquote enemies. And that's the first kind of mental orientation to all of it. So practically speaking, one way that I get at that, and that I've seen those who are walking this journey really center themselves on, that is through meditation. So it's important, if nonviolence is going to be a way of life, to wake up, if not every day, then most days, and meditate on basic goodness, on your intents for the day, and your intentions for the day, and what kind of world you'd like to see personally created through your life on that day. And then beyond that, getting involved with a community, an organizing community. Thich Nhat Hanh calls this a communities of accountability, and practicing communities that really model the values that you would like to engage in your life, and then organizing communities that can help take this nonviolent lifestyle away from an individualistic, self-serving lifestyle to something that's actually going to help and connect with the issues of our day and the people that are most affected by violence. And very often that means going beyond ourselves into a community of people who are living this day in and day out. So you got to get your feet dirty in the places that are hurting with other people who have more experience than you do, and learn from those people, sit at their feet and be neighbors with them before we ever call ourselves to helping someone else in that regard. I would read everything that Dr. King had to write on the subject. There's readers that combine his work. I would read Beyond Vietnam, the speech, and do educational work that way. There's a book that I referenced by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen called Why Civil Resistance Works, which is the strategic logic of nonviolent resistance. And that's a wonderful resource that defends and researches the use of nonviolence. Community, especially those who are coming at these issues from a position of privilege. The idea that we can think our way into the right way of living is limited by what community we're surrounding ourselves with. So get among the people who are most affected and learn from them, not in a way that burdens them to be your educator, but in a way that frees them and frees you to have the knowledge necessary to be helpful to the movement. So educate yourself, do as much of that as possible, join a practicing community, and join with those who are currently organizing and most affected by the issue. And I think within those three spheres, you will experience an incredible amount of growth over time. At communities right now, especially communities of color in urban centers around the nation, have been forced to think about how we defend our communities and how we have an alternative to traditional policing that has brutalized and maimed and murdered Black bodies. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that area of, it's been called community policing, alternative policing, whatever we call it, is less important than having clear expectations and mechanisms for how people protect their communities. And I think it's very important to note that globally, internationally, we've seen models of that done nonviolently. There are humanitarian spaces in places like Buenaventura, Colombia. I just met two wonderful activists from there. We toured the U.S. together on a Bridging the Americas tour, where we're trying to bridge the experiences and traditions of Afro-Colombians with African Americans. And we stopped by several cities along the way, including Baltimore and Ferguson and Oakland and Tennessee. And throughout that, there was this rising, burgeoning conversation of how we can begin to implement these international models for community protection. And that's a discussion that is picking up steam across the nation, but one that is worthy of our attention with how do we do this. And that's one that needs to be built up as we engage simultaneously this wonderful movement led by the Movement for Black Lives and its policy platform to abolish modern policing as we know it. And if we're going to do that, then we have to replace it with forms of community policing that really touch and protect and the people, and allow kids and elders in our communities to develop in safety and develop dreams that won't be cut off short by bullets from outside people. So that's an area that as scholars and community members engage, I'm excited to see the development of that over time. one thing that bugs me in the discussion of violence and nonviolence is we tend to put the majority of the scrutiny on the communities that are most affected by the violence of the state and other members. And so if we back up and we think through all the ways, whether soft or explicit ways, that the state is in fact violent towards people of color and black bodies especially, it's overwhelming, because you can't just go and reduce it down to the times when black people are killed in the streets. That's one form of violence. That's the one that gets the most media attention. But we have schools that are violently educating our children. They're teaching our children by the absence of resources that they're not valuable. That's the first introduction to capitalism in our society, is the schooling system, because it's sorting out the winners and the losers, the A students and the F students, those who have books and those who don't. And then you walk home from school and you have violence in the community in which you live, and then there's violence in the housing and the way in which people all across the nation are being displaced from their homes violently by the hands of military and paramilitary organizations, police forces, and the violence of gentrification in places like DC and across the nation. And you add up all the amounts of violence that black bodies endure on an everyday basis, and it bugs me, but more than that, it disgusts me that the scrutiny is then placed on us when it comes to how we respond to this incredibly impossible situation. But then you look at it and you say, how have we responded as a people? And overwhelmingly, the last 100 years and beyond that, though there have been exceptions that have been real, we responded in a way in which we are promoting a redemptive justice, a justice that isn't about revenge and killing those who have killed us, but one that is about the power of revolutionary militant love. And all across the nation, you see this. The movement for Black Lives is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful and powerful movements this country has seen, and that's a fact. And so I commend everybody out there who has chosen this route in the midst of just an impossible and fierce and deadly situation. And it's really amazing what young people around the country are doing.